Everybody, and welcome to today's edition of my Good News Bulletins. Today saw the release of more real estate data which shows how strongly placed most of our real estate markets are in terms of withstanding the worst impacts of the virus crisis. Now, these were the figures on vacancy rates across the country. Now, what I've been saying is that one of the great strengths of real estate across Australia is that vacancy rates generally were very low in most capital cities and in most regional centres as we entered the virus shutdown period. This meant that as the number of properties in the market seeking tenants rose, with some tenants vacating because of job loss, but mostly because landlords using Airbnb have now put their properties into the permanent rental pool, meant that most markets were able to absorb that extra stock and still have acceptable vacancy rates. And these new figures show that pretty well. Despite a big increase in the number of vacant properties seeking tenants in Australia, the national vacancy rate remains well below 3%, which is the commonly accepted benchmark figure. The current national vacancy rate, according to Eskim research, is 2.6% compared to 2.3% a year ago. All the capital cities except Sydney still have vacancy rates below 3%. And three capital cities, namely Adelaide, Canberra and Hobart, still have vacancy rates below 1.5% despite the increase in the number of properties available for rent. Sydney is the city that will have the most problems with vacancies. It's now close to 4% overall, and some parts of the city, notably the Sydney CBD, have much higher vacancy rates than that because of the previous reliance on short-term lettings, which are not happening at the moment. So overall, it's another solid performance by the market, but stand by for an avalanche of negative headlines tomorrow because that's what media does. It will find the negatives and focus on them. Now, one of the strongly emerging trends in residential real estate around the country is a big increase in the number of online searches for homes to buy. Last week I reported on new figures from realestate.com.au describing very major rises in the number of online searches for property compared to the same time last year, with rises of 40% in some states. This week we have new figures from another big online platform, Domain, and these show in particular a big rise in the number of people searching for properties to buy interstate. Domain says that interstate searches for properties were down in every part of the country before the coronavirus hit, but they've rebounded strongly once the shutdown began. The figures recorded a huge spike in every jurisdiction, with interstate searches for Western Australian property rising 120% in the period from March 26 to May 4. In the same period, interstate searches for Northern Territory rose 153%, and for Queensland property, searches rose 108%. Domain economist Trent Wiltshire says the rebound of interstate searches picked up once people were in lockdown. People had time on their hands and started to think about different lifestyles. Now, we're seeing day-to-day announcements about the relaxation of restrictions in the various states and territories. One of the slowest to release the core restrictions has been Victoria, but on Monday, Premier Daniel Andrews announced that on-site real estate auctions will be able to go ahead from Wednesday, tomorrow. Auctions will be limited to 10 people, plus the minimum number of people required to facilitate the sale and those selling the house. The same eased restrictions will apply for open for inspections, and real estate agents will be required to take the name and phone number of each visitor to make it easier to contact trace if there are any problems. Victoria now joins New South Wales, Western Australia, Queensland and South Australia in allowing the resumption of normal auctions and open houses. We're seeing the easing of restrictions in numerous other areas of life as well. In New South Wales, Premier Gladys Berejiklian has announced that cafes and restaurants will be allowed to reopen with up to 10 customers, and that playgrounds and pools will reopen. The New South Wales Premier says, we need to fire up our economy, we need to get people back into jobs, we need to see some semblance of normality come back. We're now seeing similar liftings of the restrictions in other states and territories. In most parts of Australia, by the coming weekend, we'll be able to go to cafes and restaurants again, although with limitations on the number of people allowed at any one time. Now, the early steps to ease the pandemic shutdown, along with the new coronavirus supplement paid to those receiving unemployment benefits, has helped to buoy spending across the economy. Overall spending in the week of from April 27 to May 4 was 7% below the pre-pandemic norm, but that was a significant improvement on the previous week, which was 20% below the pre-pandemic norm. A real-time spending tracker developed by analytics firm Alpha Beta and credit bureau Ilion shows the $550 per fortnight coronavirus supplement, which kicked in from April 27, has delivered a vital economic boost. It follows a one-off $750 federal stimulus distributed to all Social Security recipients early last month. Those who received both payments spent 28% more than normal last week, while those who received neither spent 15% less than normal. And speaking of stimulus, towns that were most impacted by last summer's bushfires will get support via local economic recovery plans as part of a new $650 million package from the federal government. The new funding will give bushfire-affected communities their share of $450 million to support the delivery of local recovery plans, with priority given to the most severely impacted regions. Many regions have been devastated not only by the bushfires, but have now also suffered more economic pain as a result of the coronavirus shutdowns. And Scott Morrison says the National Bushfire Recovery Agency will assist in driving strong economic recovery so more than 18,600 families and businesses in bushfire-affected areas can get back on their feet. Looking at some of the property market news to emerge in the last few days, auction clearance rates have improved dramatically in Sydney at the weekend to reach around 70%, reaching their highest level since mid-March after the New South Wales state government lifted its ban on public on-site auctions. Preliminary numbers collected by CoreLogic showed much lower volumes, with just 209 properties listed for auction. However, the number of withdrawn properties dropped by more than half from the previous week to just 21. And CoreLogic analyst Kevin Brogan says, we've seen a notable drop in the number of homes pulled out from auction, which signals a growing confidence amongst vendors. He says there are also more homes sold at auction than before auction, so it looks like vendors were prepared to go to on-site auctions now that it could go ahead rather than accept an offer prior to auction. I think you could say that there is a little bit more confidence in the market, he said. Melbourne has also recorded a strong result despite the ongoing ban there on public on-site auctions last weekend and open houses. The clearance rates rose to 60%, up from 57% the week before, and from now on, Melbourne will be able to return to normal live auctions. Also, across the capital city, 65% of the 430 odd homes taken to auction the weekend were sold, the first time the clearance rate has broken above 60% since late March, when the federal government imposed the initial ban on public on-site auctions and open home inspections. SQM Research Managing Director Louis Christopher said this is the fourth week of rising clearance rates. He says, I think it's fair to say that the worst of the pandemic is potentially behind us, so it's looking more likely that our forecast of a V-shaped recovery will play out. In some other market outcomes, renovation projects have become the boom industry during corona lockdowns. As I've reported in previous broadcast, spending on alterations and additions to homes was rising before the virus crisis and has become even more of a trend amid the shutdown phase with so many people stuck at home. Spending on home improvements has defied the decline in other parts of the retail sector. Overall spending on household goods through March was up 9%, according to the recent retail figures released by the Bureau of Statistics. Homeware and garden supply purchases surged 17% through the month, while electronic and electrical spending grew 11%. Housing Industry Association's Victoria Executive Director Fiona Neild says it appears many people still in work but stuck at home are using the time and cash they may otherwise have spent on going out on renovations instead. We're also seeing reports about a rise in the number of people investigating building a new home, and a study by MCG Quantity Surveyors suggests it's a good time to consider building because pricing right now is very competitive. MCG says that the most competitive building and renovation environment since the global financial crisis. And a director of that firm, Marty Sadlier, says a survey of builders has revealed that most have begun reducing quotes to secure work in the current climate. He says if you had a building contract priced and quoted 12 months ago and then had that same contract priced today, the 2020 amount to build would be considerably less. Now, looking at infrastructure projects that will help drive recovery, investigation works are ramping up and an executive director has been appointed to oversee South Australia's biggest ever infrastructure project, which is the final 10-kilometre stretch of the North-South Corridor Big Road project in Adelaide. Minister for Transport and Infrastructure Stephen Knoll says the final stage of the North-South Corridor will be the biggest single infrastructure project in South Australia's history. We already have $5.4 billion on the table to help deliver this project that will underpin thousands of jobs over the next decade and finally see the completion of the 78-kilometre North-South Corridor. In Western Australia, the state government has approved new measures to streamline construction contract approval processes and expedite $140 million worth of road and maritime projects. The measures aim to protect Western Australian jobs and create more opportunities for local businesses amidst the economic impacts of the virus crisis. The WA government has focused on streamlining the process for awarding contracts for transport and construction projects up to a value of $20 million and expediting the delivery of road and maritime projects through the new construction panel aims to assist contractors to plan and program work, save time and costs, and it's expected that more than 1,000 local jobs will be created across the 24 approved projects so far. Back in Adelaide, site works have started for a new super school in the north of Adelaide on a former market garden acquired by the state government. Graders this week started clearing a site in Anglevale for a birth to year 12 school, which will accommodate 1,675 students. The new facility will include a 75-place childcare centre and a 300-seat theatre, which will be shared with the community. Looking at some of the major property developments to be announced or advanced in the last few days, major national property developer Mirvac has lodged fresh plans for a major tower in Sydney's Circular Quay area in the centre of Sydney. Mirvac Head of Office and Industrial Campbell Hannon says the proposed plans will deliver 60,000 square metres of commercial and retail space and contribute towards the revitalisation of the iconic Circular Quay precinct. That area of Sydney already sports a project by Lend-Lease, which will become Sydney's tallest office tower. It will be anchored by US company Salesforce and open in 2022 and be the largest building in the $5 billion precinct. AMP Capital is also developing the nearby $3 billion Quay Quarter Tower, which will serve as the financial services company's global headquarters and also accommodate Deloitte in 2022. In Brisbane, Willem Constructions has been chosen to construct a retirement village within the historic Indooroopilly Golf Course. It has won the Somerset Indooroopilly contract to build 168 apartments and penthouses across 4 low-rise buildings in Brisbane's inner west. Pre-construction has begun, and while the village is due for completion in late 2021, 40% of apartments have already been reserved, with most interest coming from local residents who have grown up in the area and are keen to downsize within the same neighbourhood. And of course, downsizers are a major and growing force in real estate across Australia. Now, the final word, referring once again to the way media reports things. Media has dined out in the past week on a report from National Australia Bank which predicts price decreases of up to 10 or 15% in our biggest cities. Our news media, which is quick to challenge anything positive that comes out of the real estate industry, has accepted the NAB forecast without question, despite the reality that National Australia Bank and its chief economist Alan Oster has a long and sorry track record of getting its forecasts wrong. The headlines have inferred that prices will fall 10 or 15% this year, but in fact the forecasts are for that level of decline over 2 years, not one. None of the journalists have written the negative articles, have questioned the forecast or checked on NAB's track record of forecasting real estate outcomes, which is particularly poor. At the beginning of last year, for example, National Australia Bank predicted that house prices would fall across Australia in 2019, with the biggest falls in Sydney and Melbourne. But the outcome was price rises in the capital cities, with particularly strong increases in the 2 biggest cities, as well as Hobart, the exact opposite result to the one predicted by National Australia Bank. In other words, NAB got it horribly and hopelessly wrong yet again. Alan Oster is sadly one of the worst forecasters of real estate events in Australia, and NAB should sack him. And not surprisingly, the newspapers that did the worst job of non-journalism and reporting on this in the most negative way possible were those published by Fairfax, such as the Sydney Morning Herald and the Financial Review. And one more final word, Federal Health Minister Greg Hunt held a press conference at the weekend. Now, the content of that press briefing was overwhelmingly positive and uplifting for most Australians. The minister detailed measures being announced by the various states and territories about the lifting of restrictions, allowing some businesses and their staff to get back to work. And his statement was followed by questions by journalists at the press conference. There were 8 or 9 questions following his presentation, and every single one of them ignored the good news inherent in the government statement about the lifting of restrictions, allowing cafes and restaurants to consider reopening, for example. Every question from the media rabble was an attempt to generate conflict and therefore a negative headline. And that's because the simplistic formula of most Australian news media organisations is to generate negative headlines by reporting on conflict, and where there is no conflict, by seeking to generate it. And you have to wonder about the mentality of individuals whose main purpose in life is to go out of their way to create conflict. Rather sadly, our news media simply refuses to publish positives. And that's why I'm doing these regular news bulletins featuring the good news. And I'll do another in the next few days. Bye for now.